"End of the line," he said. "I don't carry passengers who can't pay the full fare." The stagecoach driver didn't even slow down when he threw her bag onto the road. Evelyn Parker stood in the dust, watching the wheels disappear around the bend. No town in sight, no water. Just the vast Colorado plain stretching to every horizon and a sky turning the color of a bruise. She looked down at her tattered brown dress, the last thing she owned in this world, and pressed her lips together until the tremors stopped. She would not beg. She would not break. Not today. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We'd love to see just how far this tale has traveled. The driver's name was Clarence Holt, and he had a policy. Women traveling alone paid double. Women traveling alone with a nearly empty coin purse got dropped at the nearest crossroads, and if the nearest crossroads happened to be 11 miles outside of the closest settlement, well, that wasn't Clarence's concern. He had a schedule to keep and a reputation among freight companies for never running late. Sentiment, he often told other drivers, was a luxury that ate into profit. Evelyn had known men like Clarence her entire life. She had known them in the face of her late husband, Gerald Parker, who spent 7 years promising her security and delivering nothing but debt. She had known them in the faces of Gerald's brothers, who showed up 3 days after the funeral, not to comfort her but to claim the furniture, the cookware, and the small silver brooch her mother had given her before she died. She had known them in the face of her landlord, who gave her 2 weeks to vacate before he rented the room to someone who could actually afford it. The world, she had learned, was very efficient at discarding women it no longer found useful. She was 31 years old, and by the reckoning of most people she had encountered in the past 6 months, she might as well have been invisible. But she was not invisible to herself. She picked up her cloth bag, the one with the broken strap she'd repaired 3 times with twine, and slung it over her shoulder. She surveyed the road in both directions. The stagecoach's dust trail was already settling. To the east, nothing but the way she'd come, 2 days of hard travel, and a town where she owed a week's lodging she couldn't pay. To the west, the road narrowed between 2 ridges and eventually, someone had told her, led to a settlement called Dunmore. 11 miles. She started walking. The Colorado summer did not care about her situation. The sun pressed down without apology, and within an hour her throat was dry and her worn shoes had raised 2 new blisters on her left heel. She had learned to walk through pain. That was one thing Gerald's years of empty promises had given her, a very high tolerance for continuing when everything inside her said to stop. She thought about the letter she'd sent to her cousin, Margaret, in Denver, asking if she could stay while she found work. Margaret hadn't written back. She thought about the seamstress shop in the town of Whitfield, another 30 miles beyond Dunmore, where a woman named Clara Briggs had posted a notice in a newspaper looking for experienced help. She had experience. She had worked a sewing needle since she was 8 years old. That was something. That was a direction. Directions were what kept a person from sitting down in the dust and not getting back up. By midday, she had covered perhaps 4 miles. She found a creek that ran shallow and cold under a stand of cottonwood trees, and she stopped long enough to drink and rest her feet. The water was clean. She cupped it in her palms and drank until the dryness in her throat eased, and she sat for a moment with her back against the largest cottonwood, listening to the sound of the water and the wind moving through the leaves. It was almost peaceful. Then she heard hoofbeats. She was on her feet immediately, bag in hand, stepping back from the road. 2 men on horseback came around the bend at a casual trot, and they both reined up when they spotted her. The first man was young, with a patchy beard and restless eyes. The second was older, thick, through the shoulders, with a look Evelyn recognized without any difficulty at all, the look of a man calculating what he might be able to take from someone who had nothing to lose. "Well," the older one said, pulling his horse to a full stop. "All alone out here?" "My husband is just behind me," Evelyn said immediately. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. He stopped to water the horses. "He'll be along shortly." The 2 men looked at each other. "Don't see any horses," the younger one said. Then "You're not looking in the right direction." The older man leaned forward on his saddle horn and studied her with that calculating expression for a long, slow moment. Evelyn held his gaze. She had learned that looking away was worse. Looking away told a man he'd already won something. Finally, he straightened up. "You're a long way from anywhere, ma'am." "I'm aware of that. Dunmore's still about 6 miles on." "I'm also aware of that." He looked at her a moment longer, then clicked his tongue at his horse and moved on. The younger man followed. Evelyn did not move until she could no longer hear the hoofbeats. Then she sat back down against the cottonwood, and for the first time since Clarence Holt had thrown her bag onto the road, she let herself shake for exactly 30 seconds. 30 seconds. That was her rule. She'd made it years ago, without ever naming it out loud. You got 30 seconds to fall apart. Then you put yourself back together, and you kept moving. She put herself back together, and she kept moving. By 3 in the afternoon, the sky had changed. She smelled the weather before she saw it, that particular electric heaviness that settled into the air before a summer storm in the high country. The clouds that had been small and white on the western horizon that morning had grown into massive gray towers and, as she watched, a vein of lightning split the dark underbelly of one of them. She was 4 miles from Dunmore, by her best estimate. Maybe 3.5. She was also in the middle of a road with no cover for a quarter mile in any direction except a shallow ditch that would become a trench full of rushation the moment that storm arrived. She started moving faster. The wind hit first, warm and wrong feeling, carrying grit that stung her face. Then the temperature dropped so sharply, it felt like walking through a doorway from one season to another. The first drops of rain were large and isolated, hitting the dust of the road like small explosions. Then the sky simply opened. Evelyn ran. She made it perhaps 50 yards before she understood that running was pointless. The rain was coming sideways. The road ahead disappeared into gray curtains of water. She could barely see her own outstretched hand. She cut off the road toward Bolstad rocks that offered some shelter from the wind, pressed herself against the largest one, and hunched over her bag to protect what little she had inside it, a spare chemise, the newspaper with the seamstress notice, and a small tin box containing a photograph of her mother, 8 cents, and a needle case. The storm lasted 40 minutes. When it passed, the world was clean and cold and dripping, and Evelyn was soaked through to her skin. Her tattered brown dress clung to her like a second layer of misery. She was shivering so hard her teeth clicked together. The road was now a river of red mud. She stood up anyway. She took one step toward the road, and her left ankle rolled on a wet rock, and she went down hard on her knee, and the pain was sharp enough that for a moment she just stayed there on the ground, with her hands in the mud, breathing through her teeth. "Get up," she told herself. She didn't. Not immediately. For the first time in months, something in her body simply refused the order. She stayed on her hands and knees in the mud, and she felt the full weight of everything that had happened: the funeral, the brothers taking the brooch, the landlord, the stagecoach, the 2 men on horseback, the storm, and she felt it settle on her back like a physical thing. And she thought with absolute clarity, "I cannot do this." The thought lasted exactly 5 seconds. Then, from somewhere further down the road, she heard the sound of a horse. She looked up. The rider came out of the gray mist that hung over the road after the storm, moving at a walk, picking his way carefully through the mud. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat that was wet through just like everything else. He hadn't seen her yet. She was off the road, half hidden by the rocks. She made a decision. She stood up. She walked back to the road, ankle protesting every step, and she stood in the middle of it. The horse saw her first and tossed its head. The rider looked up, and he pulled the animal to a stop perhaps 20 feet away. They looked at each other. He was older than she'd expected, somewhere in his late 30s, with a face that had been weathered by years of outdoor work into something that wasn't handsome exactly, but was entirely solid. His eyes were dark, and they moved across her with a careful, measured attention that was nothing like the older horseman from that afternoon. He wasn't calculating. He was assessing. There was a difference, and Evelyn had learned to read it. He looked at her ankle, where she was unconsciously favoring her left side. He looked at her bag, her soaked dress, the mud on her hands and knee. Then he looked at her face. "You need help," he said. It wasn't a question. "I need to get to Dunmore," she said. "How far?" "About 4 miles," he paused. "You're not going to make 4 miles on that ankle tonight." "I'll manage." In the dark. In the mud. With a storm that might come back. He said it without inflection, just the facts laid out plainly. "Ma'am, I'm Thomas Reed. I have a ranch about 2 miles south of here. My foreman's wife can get you dry clothes and a meal. In the morning, when the roads fit, I'll take you to Dunmore myself." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She thought about everything she'd been taught, about accepting help from strangers. She thought about the 2 men from that afternoon. She thought about her mother, who had always said that wisdom wasn't about refusing help, it was about reading people correctly. She read Thomas Reed, the way he kept his hands visible and relaxed on the reins. The way he'd stated his name first, unprompted. The way he wasn't pushing. "I don't take charity," she said. "It's not charity," he said. "It's just a meal and a dry place to sleep. You can work it off in the morning if it matters to you." "It matters to me. Then we have a deal." He swung down from the saddle and held the horse steady. "Can you ride?" "I can ride." She could ride. Her father had taught her before he died, back when she was 10 years old, and it was one of those things the body didn't forget. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up, and Thomas Reed took the reins and walked beside the horse, as if this were a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. She realized, as they moved through the settling dusk, that he hadn't once looked at her torn dress the way Clarence Holt had. He hadn't calculated her worth by the state of her clothes or the mud on her hands. He had simply seen a person who needed help and offered it. It was such a simple thing. It made her eyes sting in a way that the rain and the cold and the 2 threatening men on horseback had not managed to do. She blinked it away and watched the road. The Reed Ranch was larger than she expected. She heard it before she saw it, the low sound of cattle, the bark of a dog, the distant clang of something metal in a barn. Then the main house came into view, and it was a real house. 2 stories, built from timber and stone, with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front. Light glowed in the windows. There was smoke from the chimney, despite the summer warmth, which meant someone had started a fire to chase out the damp after the storm. A man came out of the barn as they rode up stocky, with a gray-streaked beard and the careful walk someone who'd spent decades working with large animals. "Boss," he said, looking from Thomas to Evelyn and back again. "Found some trouble out on the road?" "Found a woman who needed a dry place," Thomas said. "Get Martha, will you? She needs a change of clothes and something hot." The man Evelyn would learn his name was Gus Hartley, and that he had worked for Thomas Reed for 11 years disappeared without another word. Thomas helped Evelyn down from the horse, and she was careful to step on her right foot first, but he noticed anyway. "I'll get some ice from the cellar for that ankle." "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to." He handed the horse off to a young ranch hand who appeared from the direction of the barn. "Come inside." Martha Hartley was a round-faced woman in her 50s with quick eyes and capable hands, and she took one look at Evelyn and immediately became an efficient, unstoppable force of practical kindness. She pulled Evelyn into a side room, produced a dress that was plain but clean and dry, took Evelyn's wet things without comment, and had a bowl of venison stew and a cup of coffee in front of her within 20 minutes. Evelyn ate. She was ashamed of how hungry she was, and then she was ashamed of being ashamed of it, and then she was just hungry and grateful, and she ate. Thomas did not join her in the kitchen. She heard his boots on the floorboards of the main room, heard him talking quietly to Gus about something to do with a fence line on the south pasture. He was giving her space. She recognized that too. After she'd eaten and changed, and Martha had wrapped her ankle with confident, practiced hands twisted it before. "I can tell. Probably a bone that sits a little wrong now. You'll need to keep the weight off it for a few days." Evelyn sat in the small room off the kitchen and listened to the ranch settle into its nighttime sounds. She thought about what she was going to do. In the morning, Thomas Reed would take her to Dunmore. In Dunmore, she would find the stage line that ran to Whitfield. In Whitfield, there was a seamstress named Clara Briggs who might or might not still need help. If she did, Evelyn had a job. If she didn't, Evelyn would find something else. She always did. That was the plan. It was a thin plan, built on maybes and distance and a stranger's remembered notice in a 2-week-old newspaper. But it was a plan, and plans were how she got out of bed in the morning. There was a knock at the door frame. Thomas stood in the doorway, and he had a folded blanket in one hand and, incongruously, a small wrapped cloth in the other. "Ice for the ankle," he said, holding up the cloth. "And the blankets for tonight. You can have the room. It's quiet." "Thank you." She took both, then. Because silence felt wrong, this is a good ranch. It's a working ranch. He leaned against the doorframe, and in the low light he looked both younger and older, at the same time, younger in the set of his mouth, which was softer than his weathered face suggested it would be, and older in his eyes, which had the particular stillness of someone who had learned to hold things very quietly. "Where were you headed, really?" "Not just Dunmore." "Whitfield. There's a seamstress looking for help." "That's 2 days by stage." "I know. Where are you coming from?" "Colorado City." A pause. "My husband died 4 months ago." Something shifted in his face, not pity, which she was braced for, but recognition. "I'm sorry." She met his eyes directly. "I'm not looking for sympathy, Mr. Reed. I'm looking for work. That's all." He nodded once, as if she'd passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. "The offer stands. Morning stage from Dunmore leaves at 9. We'll get you there." He pushed off the doorframe and turned to go. "Mr. Reed," he stopped. "The stagecoach driver," she said. "He told me that a woman traveling alone in this territory was asking for trouble. That it was my own fault for not having a proper escort." She wasn't sure why she was telling him this. He seemed very certain about that. Thomas Reed was quiet for a moment. "What was his name?" "Holt. Clarence Holt. I know that man." His voice hadn't changed, but something in it had. "He runs freight for the Larson Company out of Colorado City. He also runs passengers, apparently, when it suits him. I'll be speaking to some people about Mr. Holt." He said it simply, not as a threat, not as a performance of gallantry. Just a statement of intention. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Parker. You've had a hard day." He left. Evelyn sat for a while longer, pressing the wrapped ice against her ankle and listening to the sounds of the ranch. The cattle, the wind, the occasional creak of floorboards from the room above, which she supposed was Thomas Reed's own room. The sounds of a life that was full of work and empty of people. She thought about what Martha had said whilst she wrapped the ankle, not meaning to reveal anything, just talking the way people who lived in small communities always talked, filling silence with information. "Reed runs this ranch alone since old Mr. Hartley died. Rest him. And Gus and I been here, but we're hired help. And it's a good place but quiet. Very quiet. He doesn't much go into town except for supplies, and he doesn't much talk to people except about cattle and fences." A man who had closed himself off from the world. Evelyn recognized that too. She'd started to do it herself, in those first weeks after Gerald died, when the grief was still genuine, before it was replaced by the exhausting logistics of survival. She'd recognized the temptation to simply stop expecting anything from people. She hadn't given in to it. She wondered if Thomas Reed ever would. In the morning, everything changed. Martha came to the door before sunrise, holding Evelyn's dress, the brown tattered one. She had mended it, not just patched the worst tear at the hem, but gone over every frayed edge with careful stitches that wouldn't be invisible to a seamstress's eye, but would hold for miles and months. "I noticed the needle case in your bag," Martha said. "Good quality needles. You do fine work." "I try." "Clara Briggs in Whitfield." Martha said it thoughtfully, as if she were tasting the name. "I know of her. She does good work too. You'd fit there." Evelyn reached out and took the dress. "Thank you," she said. "For this. For all of it." Martha waved a hand as if batting away the gratitude. "Breakfast is on. Come eat before the men get to it." The kitchen was different in the morning, louder, fuller, with 3 ranch hands who came in from the bunkhouse, stomping mud from their boots and talking over each other about the fence situation on the south pasture. They stopped when they saw Evelyn. There was a beat of silence that was not hostile but was assessing in the way that all small communities assessed strangers. Thomas was at the table already, with a cup of coffee and a map spread between the salt cellar and a folded newspaper. He looked up. "How's the ankle?" "Better." It was about 60% true. "Good enough to ride?" "Good enough." One of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete, with a sunburned nose and genuinely friendly eyes, slid a plate of biscuits toward her end of the table without being asked. It was such a small, unconsidered kindness that it was somehow harder to absorb than the big ones. "Stage leaves at 9, Thomas said, refolding the map. "We should head out by 8. Road'll be soft but passable." "I'll be ready." She was ready. But what happened next, she had not been ready for. Thomas was helping her up onto the horse, the same horse from the night before, a gray mare named Belle that moved with solid patience when a rider came up the ranch road at a pace that said trouble. Thomas turned before Evelyn could wonder what was wrong. The rider was a boy, maybe 15, with a face red from hard riding. "Mr. Reed. Message from Sheriff Holloway. Got something you need to see. Says it can't wait." Thomas took the message, a single folded note, and read it standing in the road. His face didn't change much, but his jaw tightened, and Evelyn, watching from the saddle, saw something move through his eyes that she thought was controlled anger. "What is it?" she asked. He looked up at her, and he seemed to make a decision in the moment he met her gaze. "The Pemberton Company," he said. "They filed on 2 parcels of land south of here while I was in Colorado City last week. Land that borders my property. Land I've been trying to purchase for 3 years. Filed, they own it? They filed. There's a difference." He folded the note. "They filed a claim under a provision I've never heard of, citing a survey that I don't believe has ever been conducted. My attorney in Denver says the claim is legal on paper. Sheriff wants to know what I want to do. What do you want to do?" He looked at the note again, and then at the ranch behind him, and then, finally, back at her. "I want to go to Dunmore and deal with this." He said it to himself as much as to her. "Then, Mrs. Parker, I apologize. This isn't your concern, and I told you I'd get you to town." "It's not a problem," Evelyn said. He mounted his own horse, and they rode toward Dunmore in a silence that was different from the silence of the night before charged, now with whatever the message had brought. After perhaps 10 minutes, Evelyn said, "Land fraud." He looked at her. "That's what it sounds like," she said. "A fraudulent survey, a provision nobody's heard of, filed while the landowner was out of town. My husband's business partner did something similar to 3 families in Colorado City. He used a different provision, but the method is the same." She paused. "He went to prison for it. Eventually. It took 2 years and a federal auditor." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You know about that kind of thing?" "I know what it looks like." She looked at the road ahead. "I also know that the men who do it usually believe that landowners won't fight back because the legal process is expensive and takes a long time and most people can't sustain it." "They'd be right about most people. Are they right about you?" He thought about it. Not immediately, not defensively. He actually thought about it. "No," he said. "They're not right about me." They reached Dunmore at 8:30. It was a small town, the way all frontier towns were small, a main street with a bank, a general store, a livery, a sheriff's office, a hotel, and a scattering of other establishments that came and went depending on the season and who had money. The mud from the previous night's storm had been tracked across the wooden boardwalks by early morning boots. Thomas tied both horses at the rail in front of the sheriff's office. He turned to Evelyn. "The stage," he said. "You should get your ticket." "Is the sheriff's office in that direction?" she asked, tilting her head toward the building behind him. "Yes. Then I'll come with you first if you don't mind." "I'd like to hear what the sheriff says." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why? Because," she said, "I recognized something in that note you read back there. And I might be able to help, if you want it." Thomas Reed, who had spent 11 years running a ranch by himself, who had spent a longer time than that making all his own decisions and carrying all his own weight, looked at Evelyn Parker, 31 years old, wearing a mended brown dress, with a slightly twisted ankle and a cloth bag with a broken strap repaired with twine, and said, "All right." They walked into the sheriff's office together, and nothing that followed was anything like what either of them had expected. Sheriff Holloway was a lean man in his 60s with a careful way of speaking that suggested he'd spent decades measuring words and finding most of them unnecessarily heavy. He laid out the situation the way a man lays out a map, flat, clear, without commentary. The Pemberton Land and Mineral Company had filed claims on 2 parcels of land south of Dunmore, each bordering the Reed Ranch on the south pasture side. The claims were filed under the 1877 Mineral Survey Act, a provision designed to allow mining companies to claim previously unsurveyed land, believed to contain mineral deposits. The survey attached to the filing was dated 3 weeks ago and signed by a surveyor named Edmund Crew, whose certification came from the Colorado Territory Surveying Board. "Is it legal?" Thomas asked. "On paper." The sheriff spread his hands. "The provision exists. The survey exists. The certification is valid. Your attorney is going to tell you it's legal on paper, Mr. Reed, because it is. Can I contest it? You can contest the survey's accuracy. If you can prove the survey was falsified or conducted incorrectly, the claim fails. But that means hiring your own surveyor, presenting findings to the land office in Denver, and if Pemberton contests your contest, it goes to federal arbitration." He paused. "That's 6 months minimum, a year more likely. And the legal costs." "I know what the legal costs are." Thomas's voice was quiet. "What does Pemberton actually want? That's the interesting part." The sheriff pushed a second piece of paper across the desk. "This came with the filing. It's an offer. They'll withdraw the claim if you sell them the south pasture directly. They've named a price." Thomas picked up the paper. Evelyn watched his face. The price was low. She could tell that from his expression alone, before she even saw the number. It was the price of something a company offered when it expected the person receiving the offer to be frightened enough to take whatever was given. He set the paper back down. "No," he said. The sheriff nodded slowly. "Figured that. Just wanted you to know the offer existed. What do I do first?" "Talk to your attorney. Get your own surveyor out to those parcels before Pemberton can establish physical presence on the land." And the sheriff hesitated. "And what?" "Find out who Edmund Crew is. Because I've been in this county 15 years, and I've never seen his name on a single piece of paper before last week." In the silence that followed, Evelyn said, very quietly, "May I see the filing?" Both men looked at her. She met their eyes without flinching. "I have some familiarity with this type of document. My late husband's business partner used similar filings in Colorado City. If it would help." The sheriff looked at Thomas. Thomas nodded once. The sheriff passed the filing across the desk. Evelyn read it carefully. She had always been a reader. It was one of the things Gerald had eventually resented about her, the way she read everything. Contracts and ledgers and legal notices and the fine print at the bottom of agreements that everyone else assumed was standard language. She had learned, growing up poor, that the most dangerous sentences were the ones no one read. She read every sentence. Then she went back and read one paragraph a second time. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "up this survey date. It says 3 weeks ago." "That's right. 3 weeks ago was June 14th. "About that. June 14th was a Sunday." Silence. "Government surveyors," she said, "cannot file certified surveys conducted on a Sunday. It's a territorial regulation. The certification is only valid for work conducted on business days." She set the document down on the desk with careful precision. "This survey, as filed, is legally unenforceable." Sheriff Holloway stared at her. Thomas Reed stared at her. Then the sheriff reached over slowly and picked up the document himself. He found the date. He read the paragraph she'd indicated. He set it down again and looked at Thomas Reed with an expression that was almost amused despite itself. "Well," he said, It won't end the case, Evelyn said. They'll refile with a corrected date, or they'll claim a clerical error, or they'll argue the regulation doesn't apply to the specific provision. But it buys time. Enough time to get your own surveyor on those parcels and challenge the underlying claim. Thomas Reed was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. You saw that in 5 minutes, he said. I read carefully. Where did you? Stopped himself. Started again. You said your husband's partner did something similar. Yes. How did you know what to look for? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Outside, Dunmore was waking up fully. Now she could hear wagon wheels on the street, the sound of the general store opening, somebody's dog barking at something persistent and unmovable. Because I spent 2 years helping the families he defrauded figure out how to fight back, she said. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't a surveyor. I was a woman with time and a willingness to read documents that nobody else wanted to read. She folded her hands in her lap. 3 of those families got their land back. The partner went to prison. And nobody ever thanked me by name, because I was just the dead man's wife who sat in corners and read papers. The room was very quiet. Then Thomas said something she had not expected. Mrs. Parker, he said, I'd like to offer you a different arrangement. She looked at him. Not charity, he said before she could speak. Not pity. A job. You read documents, you understand legal filings, and you clearly know how the schemes work. I need someone who can do those things while I run a ranch and fight a land claim at the same time. He held her gaze. I'll pay you a fair wage. You'll have a room at the ranch. And if you still want to go to Whitfield when this is resolved, I'll take you there myself. Evelyn looked at him for a long time. She thought about Clara Briggs and the seamstress notice. She thought about the stage that left at 9 o'clock, which she was now going to miss. She thought about what it meant to take a job from a man she'd known for less than 12 hours. She thought about the filing on the desk in front of her, and the Sunday date, and the 3 families in Colorado City, and 2 years of reading documents in corners while no one thanked her by name. Fair wage, she said. Defined as? $12 a month, he said. Same as my foreman. That was not what she'd expected. She'd expected less. She said so. You just found a flaw in a land filing that my attorney missed, Thomas said. $12 a month seems like the right price for that. And room and board. And room and board. She looked at the sheriff. He was looking at the ceiling with the careful neutrality of a man who had decided this conversation had nothing to do with him. She looked back at Thomas Reed. All right, she said. We have a deal. She did not go to Whitfield. She went back to the Reed Ranch. And when she walked through the door of the main house that afternoon, this time not as a guest to be dried and fed, but as someone who lived there, who had work to do, who had a reason to be exactly where she was, something shifted inside her that she couldn't name and didn't try to. Martha Hartley looked at her from the kitchen doorway, and then looked at Thomas, and then back at Evelyn, and her face arranged itself into an expression of entirely unsurprised satisfaction. I'll put your things in the East Room, she said. Better light in the mornings. Good for reading. Evelyn smiled. For the first time in a very long time, it felt like something she meant. The East Room had good morning light, just as Martha had promised. Evelyn was up before the ranch hands, which surprised everyone except Martha, who simply handed her a cup of coffee and pointed toward the table where Thomas had left a stack of papers the night before documents his attorney in Denver had forwarded by wire, along with a hand-delivered letter from a man named Silas Vane, who represented the Pemberton Land and Mineral Company. The letter was polite in the way that threats are polite when the person making them is confident you have no real options. Evelyn read it twice, set it aside, and started on the survey documents. By the time Thomas came down from his room at 5:30, she had filled 3 pages of a small notebook with observations, questions, and 2 columns she'd labeled provable and needs verification. She was on her second cup of coffee, and she had not looked up from the papers in 40 minutes. Thomas stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a moment. You slept, he asked. Enough. She didn't look up. The surveyor's certification is from the Colorado Territory Surveying Board. But the board's seal on this document is the version they stopped using in 1879. They updated the seal design after the territorial reorganization. Whoever made this document used an old stamp. She finally looked up. That's two defects now: the Sunday date and the outdated seal. Either one alone could be argued as clerical error. Both together suggests something more deliberate. Thomas pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. My attorney said the filing was airtight. Your attorney didn't read it carefully enough. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said, he didn't. He looked at the notebook. What's in the second column? Things I need to verify. The survey describes specific boundary markers on the south parcel iron stakes, a particular rock formation, distance measurements. If those markers don't exist on the actual land, the survey is fabricated, not just misdated. She turned the notebook so he could see it. Someone needs to go out there and check. I'll go today. Take Gus with you. Take the survey document and a measuring tape. Write down exactly what you find and what doesn't match. He looked at the list she'd made. It was specific distances, compass bearings, the particular language used to describe the boundary markers. How do you know what to look for? The Colorado City fraud case used the same technique. Vague surveys that described landmarks that either didn't exist or existed in the wrong locations. The land office in Denver accepted them because nobody went out and checked. She picked up her coffee. The surveyor assumed nobody would. Edmund Crew, Thomas said. Yes. Has your attorney found anything about him? Wire came last night. There's an Edmund Crew certified in Colorado territory, but he's been practicing out of Pueblo for 20 years. Family man. Good reputation. My attorney spoke to him directly. Thomas paused. Crew says he's never set foot in this county. Says he's never heard of the Pemberton Company, and his name is absolutely not on any survey filed in Dunmore. Evelyn set her coffee cup down. Someone forged his certification, she said. That's what it looks like. The weight of that settled between them, not just a fraudulent survey, but a forged professional certification. That was a federal crime. That changed the nature of what they were dealing with entirely. Then we're not just fighting a land claim, Evelyn said. No, Thomas said. We're not. He left for the south pasture after breakfast, taking Gus and two of the ranch hands. Evelyn stayed at the table and kept reading. It was Pete who interrupted her first, the young ranch hand with the sunburned nose, appearing in the kitchen doorway with an expression caught between curiosity and apology. Ma'am, there's a man at the front gate asking to speak with Mr. Reed. Says he represents the Pemberton Company. Evelyn looked up. What kind of man? Suits, Pete said, in a tone that summarized everything. City suits. Came in a wagon from town. There are two of them. Evelyn stood up, straightened her dress, and walked to the front of the house. The two men waiting at the gate were exactly what Pete's tone had indicated: polished, urban, wearing the kind of clothes that announced they believed themselves to be the most important people in any room they entered. The taller one had a thin mustache and a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. The shorter one carried a leather satchel and the careful blankness of someone paid to witness things. I'm looking for Thomas Reed, the tall one said. Reed is working, Evelyn said. Can I help you? The man's smile adjusted itself fractionally. She recognized the adjustment, the rapid recalculation of a person who had expected to find someone other than a woman in a plain dress standing between him and his objective. And you are Evelyn Parker. I handle Mr. Reed's correspondence and legal documents. She kept her voice pleasant and her face neutral. Your names? A pause. Silas Vane. I represent the Pemberton Land and Mineral Company. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, which she took without looking at it. I'm here regarding the land filing. I know what you're here regarding, Evelyn said. Mr. Reed has received your correspondence, Mr. Vane. He's reviewed it. Then he's aware that the deadline for the purchase offer is Friday. Yes. She finally looked at the card and then back at him. Mr. Reed declines the offer. Vane's practiced smile stayed in place, but something shifted behind his eyes. Ma'am, I think it would be better if Mr. Reed heard the full terms. Mr. Reed has heard the full terms, she said. And I've reviewed the survey documentation thoroughly, Mr. Vane. I have some questions about it that I think you'd find worth discussing before this proceeds any further. That stopped him. She saw at the flash of something that wasn't quite concern but was adjacent to it. The way a man looks when he's been told the floor is more complicated than he believed. Questions, he said carefully. The certification seal, for instance. The 1879 version, rather than the current one, and the date June 14th, which was a Sunday. And the matter of a surveyor named Edmund Crew, whose name appears to have been used without his knowledge or consent. She paused, letting each word land with exactly the weight she intended. I'm sure those are all clerical errors, Mr. Vane, and I'm sure the Pemberton Company has very clean explanations for all of them. But it would be better, I think, for everyone, if those explanations were provided before this matter reached a federal arbitrator. Silence. Vane looked at her with an expression that had stopped being practiced. She was looking at the real version of him now, calculating, cold, and for the first time genuinely uncertain. I wasn't told there was legal representation involved, he said. There's quite a lot of things you weren't told, apparently, she said. Good morning, Mr. Vane. Mr. Reed will be in touch, through his attorney in Denver. She walked back into the house and closed the door. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. She went back to the table and sat down, and picked up her coffee, and took a very slow sip, and only then allowed herself to breathe properly. Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway again. They're leaving, he said, with the tone of a man who had witnessed something unexpected, and wasn't sure whether to be impressed or alarmed. Good, she said. Tell Mr. Hartley when he gets back that we had visitors from the Pemberton Company and that I told them Mr. Reed declines the offer. Yes, ma'am. Pete started to withdraw, then stopped. Ma'am? How'd you know about all those things you said? The seal and the date and the surveyor fella? Evelyn looked at her notebook. I read, she said simply. Thomas came back from the south pasture at midday, and on the express his house he told her before he said a word. He sat down across from her, put a folded piece of paper on the table between them, and said, 3 of the 7 boundary markers described in the survey don't exist. The rock formation they reference on the eastern boundary is on the wrong side of a creek somebody measured from the wrong bank, or they described a location they'd never actually visited. He looked at her, and the distance measurements on the north boundary are off by about 400 yards. Enough to put the claimed parcel almost entirely outside the area Pemberton says they surveyed. You wrote it all down, exactly as you described. Gus witnessed it and signed the paper. Evelyn looked at what he'd written. It was thorough, Thomas Reed was. She was learning, a man who did things completely once he understood what needed to be done. This goes to your attorney today. Wire it or write it, but today. I'll write it. He was already standing. What else? Vane came this morning. He stopped. What did Vane want? He wanted to present the terms of the offer and make sure you understood the deadline. I told him you declined. She met his eyes. I also told him we'd found the defects in the survey documentation. I wanted him to know that we knew. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. You wanted him to know. If they believe you've found the errors, they have 2 choices. Withdraw and refile with a corrected survey, which requires going back out to those parcels and doing the work properly, which takes time and money. And if they do it honestly, it won't give them what they want, because the land isn't worth what they need it to be. Or they escalate. She paused. I wanted to see which one they'd choose. And if they escalate, then we'll know what we're actually dealing with. Because men who falsify surveys and forge professional certifications and offer low prices to frightened landowners don't usually escalate unless there's something worth escalating. For she held his gaze. What's on that south pasture, Mr. Reed? He was quiet for a moment. And in that moment, Evelyn saw a flicker of something she couldn't name, something that was not quite evasion but was definitely deliberate. Grazing land, he said. Good grass, reliable water from the creek. Nothing else? That's what I've always used it for. She looked at him steadily. He met her eyes, and there was nothing defensive in his expression, But there was something held back, something carefully set to one side. She chose not to push it. Not yet. There was a time for every question, and right now what mattered was the attorney in Denver. Go, she said, today. He went. The next 3 days established a rhythm that Evelyn had not expected, and Thomas seemed to find both useful and slightly unnerving. She was at the table by 5 each morning. She read everything. She made lists. She sent questions by wire to Thomas's attorney, a man named Franklin Oates, whose responses suggested he was both competent and deeply surprised to be receiving such specific, targeted inquiries from a woman he'd never met. On the second day, Oates wired back, "Who is Mrs. Parker, and where did she study law?" Thomas wired back, "She didn't. She just reads carefully." On the third day, Oates wired, "Edmund Crew is filing a complaint with the Colorado Territory Surveying Board regarding unauthorized use of his certification. Federal Land Office in Denver has been notified of potential fraud. They want documentation." Evelyn packed everything she'd compiled: the notebook, the annotated survey copies, Thomas's boundary verification notes, Gus's witness signature, the chronological record of Vane's visit, and organized it into a package for Oates that was, in her own estimation, as clear and complete as she could make it. Thomas watched her work that evening, sitting across the table with a cup of coffee he'd largely forgotten about. "You're good at this," he said. "I've had practice." She sealed the package. "Colorado City gave me a lot of practice. Tell me about it." She looked up. He wasn't asking the way people sometimes asked as a social courtesy, expecting a short answer. He was asking the way he did everything else, with that complete unhurried attention that she'd started to recognize as simply how he listened. So she told him. She told him about Gerald's partner, a man named Arthur Lund, who had spent 4 years systematically defrauding small landowners through fraudulent survey claims and forged transfer documents. She told him about the 3 families who came to her, not because she had any official standing, but because she was the dead man's wife, and she had a reputation for reading things carefully. She told him about 18 months of sitting in courtrooms and land offices and territorial hearing rooms, translating legal documents into plain language for people who'd never had cause to understand them before. She told him about the day the federal auditor finally confirmed the fraud, and the day Arthur Lund was convicted, and the way none of the 3 families had ever said her name in the newspaper accounts, because a widow's involvement in legal proceedings was considered, at best, unusual. Thomas listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the wind outside and the distant low of cattle from the north pasture. "You should have been an attorney," he said. "Women can't be attorneys in Colorado Territory." "That's a waste." She looked at him. It was such a simple statement, offered without ceremony or condescension, just a plain observation about a plain injustice, and it landed somewhere she hadn't expected. "It is," she agreed. He looked down at his coffee. "My wife would have said the same thing. She's had opinions about things like that." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife. Evelyn had known, from Martha's careful non-information, that there had been someone the way a house knows where furniture used to stand, the particular echoes of a space that was once full and is now empty. But she hadn't known the shape of it. She waited. "Her name was Catherine," he said. "She died 6 years ago, fever. We had a son, he died with her. He was 2 years old." He said it with the particular flatness of a person who has said hard things so many times the words have been worn smooth. "I built this ranch for them. Spent 3 years working 7 days a week building something worth having." He paused. "And then I had it and no reason to have it." Evelyn looked at him across the table, at this man who had built a life for people who were no longer here to live it, and she thought about the house sounds she'd noticed: the single set of boots on the stairs, the single cup on the table each morning before the hands arrived, the way Martha watched with the particular careful attention of someone monitoring a wound that had mostly healed. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 6 years ago. Time doesn't really do what people say it does." He looked up at her. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." The 4th morning brought something that changed everything. Pete knocked on the door frame before sunrise, his face tight with something that wasn't his usual open expression. "Mr. Reed, there's someone out by the south fence." Thomas was on his feet before Pete finished the sentence. Evelyn followed without being invited, and Thomas didn't stop her. There were 3 men at the south fence line, and they had equipment survey stakes, a transit level, the tools of a land measurement team. They were working by lamplight, moving with efficiency, the kind of efficiency that came from knowing exactly what they intended to do and having done it before. Thomas rode up to the fence and stopped. "This is Reed land," he said. "You're trespassing." The man in charge heavyset with a clipboard and the expression of someone who had anticipated this exact conversation held up a document. "We're operating under authority of the Pemberton filing. Until the claim is resolved, we have legal right to survey access on the parcels under dispute." "That claim is under federal review," Thomas said. As of 2 days ago, the man's expression didn't change. "Until we receive notification of a hold order from the Federal Land Office, we continue work." "Sir." Thomas looked at the survey equipment. He looked at the men who had positioned themselves between the equipment and the fence with the practiced ease of people who knew they were legally protected in the moment, even if they wouldn't be later. He looked at Evelyn, who had ridden up beside him. She met his eyes and gave the smallest shake of her head. "Not here. Not like this." He held the man's gaze for 3 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then he turned his horse. They rode back toward the house, and Thomas Reed's jaw was tight enough that Evelyn could see the muscle working from the corner of her eye. She gave him the length of the ride before she spoke. "If you'd confronted them, they'd have had grounds to file an interference complaint," she said. "That would have delayed the federal review." "I know." His voice was controlled. "I know that, he stopped." "I know," she said. They rode in silence for another moment. "Not surveying," she said. "Not really. They have the equipment, but they're staking positions. Putting markers down to establish physical presence on the land before a hold order can come through from Denver." She looked at the road ahead. "We need that hold order today. Oates is in Denver. The wire office opens at 7. Then we're there at 7. They were there at 7. The wire to Oates took 4 minutes to send and 40 minutes to get a response. And Evelyn spent those 40 minutes sitting on a bench outside the wire office with her notebook, writing a timeline of every event since the initial filing dates. Times, names, witnesses, the survey crew's arrival, and their stated justification. She wrote it in the precise, factual language she had learned from watching attorneys organize arguments, without opinion or emotion, just sequence and evidence. Oates's response came at 8:14. "Federal hold order requested this morning. Estimate 48-72 hours for confirmation. Keep surveyors off the land physically if possible, within legal means. Do not confront directly. Well done on the boundary documentation. It is exactly what we needed." "Who trained Mrs. Parker?" Thomas read it over her shoulder. "He keeps asking that. Because he can't believe a woman figured it out without a man teaching her," she said, without particular bitterness. "Just accuracy." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I don't think that's why he's asking." "No? I think he's asking because he wants to know if you're available for hire." He said it with the faint, careful dryness that she'd started to recognize as his version of a joke. She looked up at him, and something in the lightness of it, the first lightness she'd felt in days, made her almost smile. "I already have a job, Mr. Reed." "You do," he said. They walked back to the horses, and Dunmore moved around them in its ordinary morning way, and Evelyn thought, with a precision that surprised her, that this was the first time in a very long time that ordinary felt like something she was allowed to be part of. Gus was waiting at the ranch when they returned, and he had something in his hand that wasn't a regular piece of paper. It was a broadside, the kind printed for public posting, the kind that went up in saloons and general stores and anywhere people gathered. He held it up without a word. Evelyn took it. It was an advertisement. For the Pemberton Land and Mineral Company, announcing the planned developments of a new settlement in southern Colorado Territory, centered on newly acquired lands south of Dunmore, promising a railroad spur, a processing facility, and significant employment opportunities for the region. It was dated 2 weeks ago. They printed this before the claim was filed, Thomas said, reading over her shoulder. They assumed they'd already won, Evelyn said. A railroad spur, he said it slowly. There's been talk for 2 years about the Denver and Rio Grande pushing a branch south. If they're routing through this county, he stopped. Then the land they're trying to claim isn't worth what they offered you for it, Evelyn said. It's worth 10 times that. Maybe more. A railroad spur means the whole South Valley opens up for development. Whoever owns the land the spur has to cross has leverage over the entire route. Thomas was very still. That's what's on the south pasture, she said quietly. That's why they want it. He looked at her for a moment, and this time there was no held-back thing in his eyes. Just the plain weight of something understood. There was a man from the railroad company here 8 months ago, he said. He was asking about purchasing land rights. I told him I wasn't interested in selling. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't want a land rush. His voice was very even. I didn't think they'd find another way. They always find another way, Evelyn said. She looked at the broadside again. The language was confident, almost boastful, the language of a company that had already made its plans and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. They hadn't expected anyone to read the survey carefully. They hadn't expected anyone to check the boundary markers. They hadn't expected that the man they were trying to pressure into selling would have someone on his side who read everything. They had, she thought, badly underestimated the woman in the tattered dress. We need to send a copy of this to Oates, she said, and to the Federal Land Office directly. The broadside is evidence that the filing was premeditated, that they planned the fraudulent claim as a deliberate strategy, not an oversight. She looked at Thomas. This isn't a case anymore. This is a federal fraud prosecution. Thomas took the broadside from her hand and looked at it with the expression of a man who has just fully understood what he's been fighting and how large it actually is. Can you do that? He asked. Put the case together for Oates. I already have most of it. She picked up her notebook. Give me tonight. She worked until 2 in the morning. Martha left food on the table without comment and went to bed. The ranch went quiet around midnight, and Evelyn sat at the table in the lamplight and built the case the way she'd learned to build it in Colorado City, methodically, starting with the established facts and building outward to what could be proved and what could be inferred and what needed one more piece to become irrefutable. The fraudulent survey date, the outdated certification seal, the forged credentials using Edmund Crew's name, the boundary markers that didn't match the physical land, the broadside printed before the filing, the railroad spur, the low purchase offer, the surveyors sent to establish physical presence before a hold order could arrive. Each piece alone was a problem. Together they were a story, a deliberate, systematic scheme to defraud Thomas and Harnina of land worth far more than anyone involved would publicly admit. She wrote it all down, clearly, completely, in the language that federal land offices understood. At some point, she became aware that she was not alone at the table. Thomas was sitting across from her, a cup of coffee in his hand, apparently having been there for some time. You should sleep, he said. Almost done. You've been almost done for 2 hours. She looked up. He was watching her with that complete, unhurried attention, and there was something in it now that hadn't been there in the beginning, something warmer. Something that was not just the assessment of a man who'd made a practical arrangement with a capable woman, but something quieter than that, something that didn't have a practical name. She looked back down at her papers. My husband never once asked me about my work, she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. In 7 years, he never once sat across a table and waited while I finished something. Thomas was quiet for a moment. That's a long time to be unseen. The words were so simple and so precisely right that she had to stop writing for a moment. She pressed her lips together and waited for the thing behind her eyes to pass. Yes, she said when it had. It is. She finished the document 20 minutes later and set down her pen. Done, she said. Thomas looked at the stack of papers, organized, annotated, complete. He didn't say anything for a moment. Evelyn, he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She noticed that. What Lund did in Colorado City, what Pemberton is doing here, Men like that count on people being alone, he said. Being too tired and too isolated to fight back. He looked at her directly. You weren't alone in Colorado City either. Those families had you. They had me and nobody knew it. I know it. He said it quietly. And I am not going to forget it. She looked at him across the table, in the lamplight, in the quiet house, and she thought about what Martha had said about this place being very quiet, and she thought that it wasn't quiet anymore, not in the way it had been before she arrived. Something had shifted in the air of the house, some fundamental quality of it, the way a room changes when someone opens a window. She gathered her papers. I'm going to sleep, she said. In the morning we wire this to Oates. In the morning we wire it to Oates, he agreed. She stood and walked toward the east room, and at the doorway she stopped. Mr. Reed, she said. Thomas, he said, before she could continue. She looked back at him. You keep calling me Mr. Reed, he said. It seems formal, given the circumstances. She considered this. Thomas, she said. He nodded. She went to her room. And Thomas Reed sat at the table for a while longer, looking at the stack of papers she'd built from nothing but her own attention and her refusal to let anyone get away with something that was wrong. And he thought about Catherine. And he thought about 6 years of quiet, and he thought that the east room had not had lamplight in it at 2 in the morning since the year the house was built. He thought that he didn't mind. He picked up his coffee and found it cold, and drank it anyway, and went upstairs. Outside, the Colorado night was immense and full of stars, and the south pasture sat under all of it, quiet and contested, and worth more than anyone except a handful of powerful men, and one very careful woman fully understood. The federal hold order arrived on a Thursday. Oates sent it by wire at 7 in the morning, and Pete ran the message from town to the ranch in under 20 minutes, arriving at a pace that told Evelyn everything before she'd even unfolded the paper. She read it standing in the kitchen, Thomas beside her, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him the way he held still when something mattered, the opposite of how most men responded to tension. The order was real. The Federal Land Office in Denver had suspended the Pemberton filing pending investigation of fraudulent documentation. The survey crew operating on the south pasture boundary was legally required to cease all activity immediately. Thomas exhaled slowly. Not relief exactly, more like a man setting down something heavy enough to have changed his posture. They have to stop, he said. They have to stop today, Evelyn said. It needs to be served to them directly. The order has to physically reach the crew on the ground, or they can claim they weren't notified. I'll ride out with Sheriff Holloway. I'm coming with you. He looked at her. I put that case together, she said. I want to see it delivered. He didn't argue. Sheriff Holloway rode with them to the south pasture, the hold order folded in his breast pocket, his face carrying the particular expression of a man who finds satisfaction in moments like these, but has too much dignity to show it openly. The survey crew was already at work when they arrived. 3 men with equipment, moving along the fence line with the confidence of people who had not yet heard that their footing had changed overnight. The foreman, the same heavy-set man aboard from 4 days ago, looked up and saw the sheriff, and something shifted in his face immediately. Not guilt exactly, but the particular alertness of a man whose calculations have just been disrupted. Holloway served the order without theater. Read the relevant sections aloud. Ask the foreman to confirm receipt. The foreman looked at the paper for a long time. Then he looked at Thomas. Then last, he looked at Evelyn, and it was a look she recognized. The look of a man trying to understand how a woman in a plain dress had become the obstacle between his employer and a significant amount of money. She met his gaze without expression. This isn't over, the foreman said. No, Thomas agreed. It isn't. The crew packed their equipment. It took 40 minutes, and every one of those minutes had the tight, charged quality of a room in which someone might yet say the wrong thing and change the nature of the day entirely. Nobody did. The wagons rolled out. Sheriff Holloway watched until they'd cleared the property line and then tucked the order copy into his pocket. Good work, he said to Evelyn, simply and directly, as if it had never occurred to him that it was unusual. She liked him considerably for that. Riding back to the ranch, the relief she'd expected didn't fully arrive. Instead, she found herself turning over the foreman's last words, "This isn't over," and feeling the truth of them with the particular precision of someone who had been through this before. "In Colorado City," she said, after Lund lost his first challenge, he went quiet for about 3 weeks. Then he came back with a different strategy, more aggressive, more personal. Thomas rode beside her, looking at the road ahead. "You think Pemberton will do the same? I think a company that printed advertising before their fraudulent claim was filed is not a company that gives up when a first approach fails." She looked at him. "I think we need to know more about Pemberton. Who owns it? Where the money comes from. Whether this is one operation or part of something larger." Oates is an attorney. He can research legal filings and corporate registrations. But there are things that don't appear in legal filings. She thought for a moment. "Martha said you don't go into town much. I go when I need to. People talk in towns. They talk especially when they think nobody important is listening." She paused. "I'd like to go to Dunmore. Not on official business. Just to listen." He looked at her sideways. "You want to gather intelligence in a saloon. I want to have coffee in the general store and listen to what people say about the Pemberton Company. A beat. Though a saloon would probably yield faster results." The faintest trace of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the shape one would take. "I'll take you to town tomorrow," he said. Martha had dinner waiting when they returned, and the mood at the table that evening was different from the controlled tension of the past week. Gus told a story about a fence repair that had gone dramatically sideways, and Pete laughed so hard he knocked over his water glass. And Thomas, sitting across from Evelyn, looked more at ease than she'd seen him, looks since the morning the first wire arrived from Oates. She watched him when he wasn't watching her. She had been doing that more than she'd intended. It wasn't sentiment, or at least she told herself it wasn't, with the firm practicality she applied to most things. It was observation. Thomas Reed was a man worth observing. Not for the reasons that most women were told to observe men: his property, his stability, his social standing. But for the way he listened before he spoke, for the way he treated Gus and Martha and Pete, not as employees, but as people whose opinions genuinely informed his own. For the way he'd looked at the hold order that morning, and the first thing out of his mouth hadn't been satisfaction about winning, but concern about making sure it was properly served. She thought about Gerald, who had been charming and careless, and whose concern for other people had always been exactly as deep as it needed to be to get what he wanted. She thought about the man sitting across the dinner table from her, who had found a woman in the mud and walked his horse, so she wouldn't have to carry her own weight, and hadn't once mentioned it as something she owed him. She looked back at her plate and ate her dinner. Dunmore the next morning was ordinary, in the way that small towns were ordinary, the same faces in the same routines, the kind of familiarity that created its own ecosystem of information. Evelyn had learned in Colorado City that the most useful conversations happened in spaces where people were comfortable enough to speak freely, but public enough that they weren't saying anything they'd be ashamed to have heard. The general store was exactly that space. Thomas had business at the bank, which suited her. She went to the general store alone, bought a length of thread she genuinely needed, and settled into the unhurried conversation that Mrs. Pauline Greer, who had run the store for 14 years, seemed to consider as important a part of her service as the goods on her shelves. Mrs. Greer knew about the Pemberton filing. Everyone in Dunmore did. It seemed the hold order had moved through town faster than any official communication Evelyn had ever seen. "There are people happy about it," Mrs. Greer said, weighing out a measure of dry beans for a customer with the practiced inattention of someone conducting two conversations simultaneously. "And people who aren't. Who isn't happy about it?" Evelyn asked. "Men who were told Pemberton would bring jobs, railroad work, construction, that kind of thing." Mrs. Greer set the beans aside. "Mr. Calloway at the hotel, he was practically planning an expansion. Reckoned the railroad spur would double his business." "Where did they hear about the railroad spur?" "Man named Dawes," said the customer, who had apparently decided to join the conversation. He was older, weathered, with the hands of someone who worked cattle. Chester Dawes. He came through Dunmore about 6 weeks ago. Said he was representing investors interested in the territory's development. Bought drinks for half the town. Talked about all the money that was going to come in once Pemberton established its operations down south. Chester Dawes, Evelyn repeated, keeping her voice casual. Smooth talker, the customer said. The kind of smooth that makes you feel good while he's doing it, and then wonder later what exactly he said. He picked up his beans. I didn't buy him a drink back, smart man, Mrs. Greer said. Evelyn bought her thread and left. She found Thomas outside the bank, leaning against the post with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who has just received news he expected but didn't want. The bank in Dunmore has a deposit from the Pemberton Company, he said, before she could speak. $12,000. Deposited 6 weeks ago, the same week the survey was allegedly conducted. He paused. The bank manager told me because he's been worried about it. He says the account was opened by a man named Chester Dawes. Evelyn looked at him. Chester Dawes, she said. You've heard that name. Just now. In the general store. She told him what the customer had said. Thomas listened with his jaw tight. Dawes came to Dunmore 6 weeks ago, spent money and made promises, and opened a company account the same week a falsified survey was being attached to a fraudulent land claim. She thought about it. He's not just a representative. He's the one running the operation on the ground. Where is he now? That's the question. They walked back toward the horses, and Evelyn was already ordering the new information in her mind, fitting it against what she already knew. Chester Dawes, a smooth talker, a man who bought drinks and made promises and deposited $12,000, and then disappeared before anyone could ask him specific questions. She'd known men like Chester Dawes in Colorado City. Arthur Lund had employed 2 of them. They were useful because they were charming and they didn't appear in corporate registrations or official documents. They were the human face of operations that preferred not to have a human face. I need to wire Oates, she said. There's more, Thomas said. She looked at him. The bank manager, his name is Weber. Walter Weber, he told me something else. Thomas paused. He said a man came in last week, asking questions about the Reed Ranch account. About the balance. About how much debt the operation was carrying. The air changed. Someone is assessing whether you can sustain a long legal fight, Evelyn said. That's what I think. If they know you have the resources to wait them out, they'll try to move faster. Find a way to accelerate the legal process. Create complications that require immediate, expensive responses. She felt the familiar chill of a pattern she recognized. This is what Lund did. When the legal challenges started failing, he switched to financial pressure. He called in debts, created disputes with suppliers, made the people fighting him spend money they couldn't spare defending themselves on multiple fronts simultaneously. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I don't have debt. The ranch is clear. Then they'll try something else. She stopped walking. Thomas, did you tell anyone about the railroad man who came 8 months ago? Anyone at all? He thought about it. Oates, he said slowly. I mentioned it to Oates when I asked him to look into the Pemberton filing. Just background. No one else? Gus knew. He was there when the man came. Nobody in town? I specifically didn't tell anyone in town because I didn't want. He stopped. Weber, he said. She looked at him. I mentioned it to Weber, he said. 2 months ago, in passing. I was asking about a loan for fence materials, and I said something about not wanting to sell because there might be development value in the south pasture. His voice had gone very flat. I said it without thinking, and Weber told someone, Evelyn said. Weber told Dawes. He said it with the particular controlled anger of a man who has just understood precisely how he was found. That's how Pemberton knew the south pasture was worth targeting. That's how they knew I'd refused the railroad inquiry. They stood on the main street of Dunmore, while that understanding settled into its full, ugly shape. Weber may not have known what he was doing, she said carefully. He may have mentioned it innocently to a man who bought him drinks and seemed like a legitimate businessman. Or he may have been paid for the information. Yes. She looked at him directly. We need to tell Oates about Dawes and about Weber. Both of them. The 12,000 deposit, the account inquiry, the timing. Oates will know what to do with it. And Weber? Nothing. Yet. If Weber is working with Pemberton and we confront him, we lose our advantage. If he's innocent, confronting him doesn't help us. She paused. We let Oates handle it through the federal investigation. Thomas looked at her for a moment. She could see the effort it took the part of him that wanted to walk back into that bank and have a direct, unambiguous conversation with Walter Weber. She understood that impulse entirely. She'd had it herself in Colorado City more than once. All right, he said. I know, she said. I know it's hard. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted the recognition that she did know, specifically and genuinely, not as a platitude, but as someone who had swallowed similar impulses in similar situations and understood what it cost. Let's go wire Oates, he said. The wire took 20 minutes to compose, because Evelyn wrote it, and she wrote carefully, even in wire format, no wasted words, but every necessary word present and precisely placed. Oates's response came back within the hour, which told her the attorney was either waiting by the wire office or had someone doing it for him. Dawes is known to federal investigators in 2 other territories. Pattern matches previous operations. Do not approach Weber. Do not confront Dawes if he surfaces. Contact me immediately if either appears at the property. This is larger than one land claim. Federal marshals are aware. Evelyn read it twice. Thomas read it over her shoulder and said nothing for a moment. Then federal marshals. Yes, this isn't just about my ranch. No, she looked up at him. It probably never was. Your land was one piece of a larger pattern. Pemberton, or whoever is behind Pemberton, has probably done this before. Other ranchers, other territories, other fraudulent surveys and forged certifications. She folded the wire. You may not be the only person fighting this. You may be the first one who had the documentation to back effectively. He was quiet for a long time. Oates knew about Dawes already, he said. Oates's response came very fast, she agreed. He had information ready. He was waiting for us to find Dawes's name. He should have told us. He may have been told not to. If there's a federal investigation already in progress, sharing information prematurely could compromise it. She thought about this. Or he was protecting us from the scope of it until we had to know. I don't like being protected from things I need to know. Neither do I. She met his eyes. But I trust Oates's judgment so far. He's been right about everything else. Thomas took the wire from her and looked at it once more. Federal marshals, he said again, quietly, as if he were still absorbing the weight of what that meant. She let him absorb it. They rode back to the ranch in an afternoon that had turned gray and cool, the summer heat finally breaking, and Evelyn thought about the scope of what Oates's wire implied, not one fraudulent claim but a pattern. Other ranchers in other territories, a federal investigation already in motion. She had walked into something much larger than a local dispute over grazing land. And she thought about the families in Colorado City, the ones who had fought Lund for 2 years, and she thought that patterns like this didn't end on their own. They ended because someone stood in the middle of them and refused to move. She was good at that. 3 days after the Dunmore trip, Chester Dawes came to the ranch. He came alone, in the middle of the morning, riding a horse that was too good for a man who didn't want to be noticed, and he had the easy, practiced confidence of someone who believed that charm was a skeleton key. Pete saw him coming up the road and went to find Thomas, but Dawes had already dismounted at the gate by the time Thomas came out. Evelyn was watching from the porch. Dawes was younger than she'd imagined, mid-30s, with dark hair and an open, pleasant face that had probably disarmed a great many people in a great many territories. He shook Thomas's hand with the warmth of an old acquaintance. He smiled. He gestured at the ranch with genuine seeming admiration. Fine operation you have here, Mr. Reed. What do you want, Mr. Dawes? Thomas said. Not rude, just direct. Dawes's smile adjusted without disappearing. He was good at that. Just a conversation, man to man. I think there may have been some misunderstanding about the Pemberton Company's tensions, and I'd like the opportunity to clear the air. The Federal Land Office doesn't think there's been a misunderstanding. Federal processes are slow and often confused. I'm offering something faster. He glanced at Evelyn on the porch, a quick, assessing look that he smoothed over immediately with a polite nod. Perhaps we could speak privately. Mrs. Parker handles my legal correspondence, Thomas said. Whatever you say to me, you say in front of her. Dawes's smile held, of course. He turned to include her. Mrs. Parker. I've heard your name recently, have you? She said. She came down the porch steps and stood beside Thomas without making it a statement. It simply felt like where she should be. The Pemberton Company is prepared to increase its offer, Dawes said. Substantially. We recognize that the initial figure may have seemed. No, Thomas said. Dawes blinked. The smoothness slipped just for a moment, and beneath it she caught the first glimpse of something harder. Mr. Reed, I haven't mentioned the new figure yet. It doesn't matter what the figure is, Thomas said. The answer is no. It was no before your company filed a fraudulent survey claim, and it's no now. The survey dispute is a legal technicality that a forged certification using a real surveyor's name without his knowledge isn't a technicality, Evelyn said. Edmund Crew has filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Territory Surveying Board and is cooperating with the federal investigation. That's not a technicality. That's a crime. Silence. Dawes looked at her with the first entirely unguarded expression she'd seen on him, and it was not pleasant. Not threatening, not overtly, just cold and calculating and suddenly very direct. You're well informed, Mrs. Parker. I read carefully, she said. It's a habit. It's an interesting habit for a woman in your position. My position, she said, letting the phrase sit in the air for a moment. And what position is that, Mr. Dawes? He looked at her steadily. A woman traveling alone, new to this territory, without family or established connections. He said it pleasantly, the way a man says something that is intended to be heard as a description but functions as a threat. It can be difficult to find stable employment in such circumstances. Thomas took one step forward. It was not a large step. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't put his hand on anything. He simply moved, and the quality of his stillness changed in a way that communicated, with absolute clarity, that the conversation had reached a boundary. You're done here, he said. His voice was very quiet. Dawes looked at Thomas for a moment. The calculation ran visibly behind his eyes, what this man would do, what could be gained, what had been lost. Then he stepped back. We'll continue this through the appropriate channels, he said. The smoothness was back. Good day, Mr. Reed, Mrs. Parker. He mounted his horse and rode out without hurrying. The moment he was through the gate, Evelyn said, Wire oats. Right now. Already thinking it, Thomas said. She turned to Pete, who had witnessed the entire exchange from a careful distance. Did you see what direction he came from? From town, Pete said. But he was at the Henderson spread yesterday. One of the Henderson boys mentioned it this morning. The Henderson spread bordered the Reed Ranch to the east. Evelyn looked at Thomas. He's talking to the neighboring landowners, she said. Thomas understood immediately, building a coalition of sellers. If he can get 2 or 3 neighboring ranches to sell to Pemberton, they establish a land position in the valley without needing the south pasture. Then they can pressure the railroad to route around me. His jaw tightened. Or they get enough surrounding land that my parcel becomes landlocked and worthless for development. Can he do that? The Henderson family has been struggling since the drought last year. If Pemberton offers them enough. He stopped. I need to talk to Bill Henderson. Yes, she said. But carefully. Don't ask him not to sell, that's his decision to make. Tell him what you know about Pemberton. About Dawes. About the federal investigation. Let him make an informed choice. And if he sells anyway, then he sells. But he deserves to know who he's selling to. Thomas rode to the Henderson spread that afternoon. Evelyn wired Oates about the visit and about Dawes's implied threat. Oates responded within 2 hours. Dawes's visit to Reed property constitutes potential witness intimidation given active federal investigation. Documenting this. Do not engage further with Dawes directly. Henderson's situation concerning Pemberton has made offers to 6 landowners in the county, according to our investigation. Most are uninformed about the fraud. We are preparing to go public with the investigation findings within 2 weeks. Until then, hold position. You are doing exactly the right things. So is Mrs. Parker. She read that last sentence twice. So is Mrs. Parker. She was sitting alone at the table when Thomas came back from the Henderson spread, and she could read the result on his face before he spoke. Bill Henderson listened, Thomas said. He didn't make any promises. He sat down across from her and put his hat on the table. He's a good man in a hard spot. 2 boys to feed, a wife who's been sick all spring, a note at the bank that's coming due in October. He looked at the table. He said he'd think about it. That's all you could ask for. He might still sell. He might. She looked at him directly. That's not your fault, Thomas. What Pemberton is doing is counting on men like Bill Henderson, being in exactly the position he's in. That's the point of it. They find people who are vulnerable, and they offer them a way out. Her voice was even. The only way to fight that is to take away Pemberton's ability to make the offer. The federal investigation does that. 2 weeks, he said. Oates says 2 weeks. 2 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. It feels like a long time. I know, a lot can happen in 2 weeks. I know that too. She paused, so we stay ready. The week that followed was the hardest stretch of the fight, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. Pemberton went quiet. Dawes didn't reappear. No new filings came from Denver. No new wires from Oates with any substance to them. Just the ordinary work of the ranch. The ordinary rhythm of days. And underneath all of it, the constant, low-level tension of waiting for the other shoe to fall. Evelyn noticed what the waiting did to people. Pete and the other hands grew restless, starting conversations that trailed off, watching the south gate with the peripheral attention of people who'd been told to expect something without being told what. Gus Hartley grew quieter and more deliberate, which Martha said was how he'd always responded to trouble. Martha herself baked more than usual, which Evelyn recognized as the same instinct and need to do something productive when the thing you were actually waiting for required stillness. Thomas worked. He worked with the relentless, complete focus of a man who had found something to do with his hands and intended to keep doing it until the world resolved itself or required him to stop. He was up before sunrise and working long after the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse. Fence repairs, cattle rotation, a barn repair that had been deferred for 2 seasons. Evelyn watched him move through the days and understood that this was how he'd gotten through the years after Catherine and the boy by working until up the shape of his grief was worn smooth by you. She understood it because she had done the same thing after Gerald died. Not grieving exactly. She'd had the honesty to admit to herself early that what she felt was not grief but the exhaustion of having hoped for something for a long time and been disappointed, which was its own kind of loss. But she had worked, and working had kept her moving, and moving had kept her alive in the ways that mattered. On the 8th day of quiet, she found him in the barn after supper, repairing a piece of tack that didn't particularly need repairing. She sat down on a hay bale a few feet away and watched him work for a while. "You're going to fix that strap so thoroughly it'll outlast the horse," she said. He looked up, almost smiled. Probably. She looked at her hands for a moment. Outside, the evening was settling in, and the sounds of the ranch were the familiar sounds she'd learned in the weeks since she arrived, the particular calls of specific animals. The way the wind moved through that stand of trees near the north fence, the creak of the weather vane on the barn roof when it turned. She had learned this place. She had not meant to. She had meant to be temporary, to solve a problem and then go to Whitfield, to Clara Briggs and her seamstress shop and the clean, uncomplicated existence of a woman who kept to her own work and didn't ask anything of anyone. She was not sure when that plan had stopped feeling like a destination and started feeling like a retreat. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. When this is over, when the federal investigation closes, and the claim is dismissed, what happens to this place?" He set the tack down. "Same as always, it's a ranch. You work it. I mean..." She stopped. Tried again. "When I came here, I was on my way to Whitfield. That was the plan, I remember. The plan hasn't changed." She looked at him steadily. I want to make sure you understand that. I haven't assumed anything about this arrangement beyond what we agreed. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. His hands were still on the tack, and he looked at her with the same unhurried, complete attention he brought to everything. And she felt it the way she'd felt it from the beginning, like being genuinely seen by someone who was not looking for anything in return. I know you haven't assumed anything, he said. You're not the kind of person who assumes things. No, the arrangement was a job, he said. That's still what it is, unless you decide it's something else. He paused. I'm not going to decide that for you. She looked at him. Thomas, she said, he said. And then Pete came running from the direction of the house, calling out, his voice carrying the tight note that they'd all learned to hear. In the last 2 weeks, the note that said something has happened, and it cannot wait. She was on her feet before Pete reached the barn door. Wire from Oates, Pete said, breathing hard. Came to town half an hour ago. Man wrote it out. He held out the paper. He said it was urgent. Evelyn took the wire and read it. Thomas came to stand beside her. The wire was brief. Investigation compromised. Someone inside Federal Land Office tipped Pemberton. Dawes has left the territory. Pemberton filing documentation has disappeared from Denver office. Without original documentation, case cannot proceed. I need everything you have, every copy, every note, every annotation. Send it all. Immediately. If the originals are lost, your copies may be all that is left. She looked up at Thomas. He had read it over her shoulder, and his face was very still. She thought about the stack of papers in the East Room. The annotated survey copies. The notebook with 3 weeks of careful observations. The boundary verification notes in Thomas's handwriting with Gus's witness signature. The broadside. The chronological timeline she'd written at 2 in the morning. Everything she had built from nothing but her own attention. It's all there, she said. Everything. Exactly as I organized it. How fast can you copy it? She was already moving. Get me more lamp oil, she said. It's going to be a long night. She worked by lamplight until the oil ran low, and Thomas brought more without being asked. The East Room had never been louder than it was in silence, the scratch of her pen against paper, the occasional sound of Thomas moving through the house, checking windows, bringing coffee she drank without tasting. She copied everything, not just the documents themselves, but the annotations, the marginal notes she'd made in her own hand, the cross-references between pages that connected one piece of evidence to another. She copied them in the same order she'd organized the originals, with a cover sheet explaining the structure because Oates would need to understand what he was receiving and why each piece mattered. She had learned in Colorado City that a pile of correct documents was not the same thing as a case. A case was a story told in evidence, with a beginning and a sequence and a conclusion that followed necessarily from everything that came before. She had built that story over 3 weeks. Now she was building it again, from memory and from copies, in a single night. Thomas came to the doorway at midnight. How much more? 2 hours, she said without looking up. He went away and came back 20 minutes later, with a plate of cold biscuits and sliced meat that she ate with one hand while writing with the other. He sat down across from her and didn't speak, which was exactly right. His presence was steadying in a way she had stopped trying to analyze. It was simply true, she worked better when he was in the room, not because he did anything, but because his stillness was a kind of ballast. At 2:30 in the morning, she set down her pen. Done, she said. He looked at the stack. It was substantial, not as thick as the originals, because she'd been ruthless about what to include and what was duplicative, but complete in the ways that mattered. Every defect in the survey, every piece of evidence of premeditation, every witness statement and verified measurement and date discrepancy. This is everything, he asked. Everything that counts. She looked at the stack. The originals are gone from the Denver office, but we have copies of everything we submitted. We also have the originals of the documents we generated here, the boundary verification notes, Gus's witness signature, the broadside. Those never went to Denver. Someone inside the land office took everything. Took or destroyed. Yes. She pressed her hands flat on the table. which means someone inside the federal system is working with Pemberton. Oates already knows that. The question is how far up it goes. Thomas looked at her steadily. Could they get to Oates? She had been thinking about this since she'd read The Wire. He sent the warning himself, she said. If he were compromised, he wouldn't have told us what happened. He would have let the investigation die quietly and told us later that the case had insufficient evidence. She paused. I think Oates is clean. I think he's scared, which is why he's asking for everything we have. A frightened attorney in Denver, Thomas said, and a woman in a ranch house with a pen and a lamp. And copies, she said. Don't forget the copies. He almost smiled, not quite, but close. In the morning, Pete rode to Dunmore with the package before sunrise, with instructions to wire Oates that it was coming and to send the documents by the fastest available courier from the Dunmore office to Denver. Thomas paid for the fastest rate without being asked whether the cost mattered. It didn't, and they both knew it. Gus watched Pete ride out from the barn doorway. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, to no one in particular, this got bigger than a land claim. Yes, Thomas said. How much bigger? We don't know yet. Gus chewed on that. You trust the attorney? Evelyn does, Thomas said. That's good enough for me. Gus looked at Thomas with the particular expression of a man who has known someone for 11 years and is observing something new in them. He didn't say anything about the expression. He just nodded and went back into the barn. Evelyn had heard the exchange from the porch. She stood with her coffee and thought about what Gus's expression meant and decided she didn't have time for it right now. What she had time for was the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since she'd read Oates's wire the night before, the question of who inside the federal land office had tipped Pemberton, because that person had to know what was in the investigation file. That person had to know that the documentation was the central threat. And they had acted fast, within days of Oates formally requesting the investigation materials. Which meant they were close enough to the investigation to know its status in real time. She went back inside and wrote a letter to Oates. Not a wire letter, long and specific, because some things were too nuanced for wire format. She told him what she was thinking. She told him to look at who had access to the investigation file, and when, specifically in the window between Oates's formal request and the disappearance of the documents. She told him that the person who acted was either panicked or confident, and based on the speed of the action she thought confident, which meant they believed they had cover. She sealed the letter and added it to the package going to Denver. Then she went to find Thomas, because there was something else she'd been thinking about, and she needed to say it before it became too large to approach directly. He was in the north pasture, checking the water trough, and she walked out to him with the deliberate pace of someone who has decided to say something and is not going to find a reason not to. There's something I need to tell you, she said. He turned. Last night, when I was copying the documents, I realized something. The broadside, the Pemberton advertisement printed before the filing, the only people who saw us present, that as evidence were Oates, the federal land office, and Sheriff Holloway. She paused. And Silas Vane, on the day I told him we'd identify defects in the survey. Thomas was very still. Vane knew we had the broadside, she said. Vane knew we were building a federal case before Oates formally filed the investigation request. If someone at the land office tipped Pemberton, they'd have needed to know that the case was serious enough to warrant action. She looked at him. But the land office didn't receive our documentation until after Oates filed. Vane knew before that. Vane told someone what we had, Thomas said. Vane may be more than a company representative, she said. He may be connected to the person inside the land office. They looked at each other. I put all of this in the letter to Oates, she said. I wanted you to hear it from me directly, not from a wire response. Why? She thought about how to say it. Because this is your land and your fight, and I've been making decisions about how to pursue it, and I think you deserve to know my reasoning, not just my conclusions. Thomas was quiet for a moment. I've never had to explain my reasoning to anyone, he said. I've just made decisions and lived with them. I know. She looked at him directly. I think that's been lonely, He looked at her, and in his face she saw something that wasn't surprise exactly. Because she thought he'd known. It was lonely. Known it the way you know the temperature of a room you've been sitting in for so long you've stopped noticing it until someone else walks in and their expression tells you what the air actually feels like. Yes, he said, it has been. She nodded. She didn't push further. Some things needed to be said and then given room to breathe. What do we do now, he asked. We wait for Oates. And we don't let Pemberton think we're scared. The waiting was different this time. Harder. Because now they knew the opposition had reached into the federal system, which meant the ground they'd believed was solid had turned uncertain. Evelyn felt it in the way she slept or didn't sleep, and in the way she read the same paragraph of a document twice without absorbing it, which had never happened to her before. On the second day after the package went to Denver, Silas Vane came back. Not alone this time. He came with two other men, one who was clearly an attorney, carrying the particular posture of someone paid to be formidable, and one who said nothing and stood slightly apart and watched everything with the careful attention of a man performing a function he didn't need to explain. Thomas met them at the gate. Evelyn stood beside him. She had stopped waiting to be invited. Vane looked different. The practiced pleasantness was still there, but it was thinner. She could see the edges of it now, the way you see the grain of wood through a layer of paint that's been applied too quickly. Mr. Reed, he said, I'm here with Pemberton's legal counsel, Mr. Hargrove, and a representative of the Colorado Territorial Development Authority. Thomas said nothing. He was watching the third man, the one who stood apart. Evelyn was watching him too. The Territorial Development Authority. She knew that name. It appeared in the fine print of two of the original Pemberton documents, mentioned as a co-authorizing body for the planned railroad spur development. What authority does the Territorial Development Authority have over private land? She said. Hargrove, the attorney, looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been asked a question by someone he hadn't expected to speak. He adjusted. The TDA has oversight authority over land parcels within designated development corridors under the 1880 Territorial Organization Act. Has the south pasture of the Reed Ranch been designated within a development corridor? A pause. A preliminary designation. Was the landowner notified of that designation as required under the same act? Longer pause. Mr. Reed, Vane said, redirecting smoothly, I'm here because Pemberton wants to resolve this without further legal complication. The federal investigation is ongoing, Evelyn said. The documentation supporting it has been replaced, she said. Completely. Copies of everything submitted to the Denver Land Office, plus originals of documentation generated on this property, are in the hands of Mr. Franklin Oates as of this morning. She watched Vane's face very carefully. Including documentation of the Pemberton broadside, the forged crew certification, the Sunday survey date, the boundary marker discrepancies, and the account opened by Chester Dawes at the Dunmore Bank 6 weeks before the fraudulent filing. Vane's face did not change. It was a very controlled face, and she gave him credit for that. But the third man, the TDA representative, looked at Vane with an expression that was quick and involuntary, and Evelyn filed it away immediately. He hadn't known about all of those things. Vane had not told him the full scope of what the case contained. There was a fault line in the Pemberton coalition, and she had just found it. The TDA representative, she said, turning to the third man directly. Your name, sir? He looked surprised to be addressed. Aldrich. Martin Aldrich. Aldrich, are you aware that Edmund Crew, the surveyor whose certification was attached to the Pemberton filing, has filed a criminal complaint with the Colorado Territory Surveying Board for unauthorized use of his professional credentials? Aldrich looked at Vane. Are you aware, she continued, that Chester Dawes, who opened the Pemberton account at the Dunmore Bank, is currently the subject of federal inquiry in 2 other territories for similar land fraud operations? Aldrich's expression had changed entirely. He looked like a man standing in a room that was smaller than he'd believed when he'd entered it. Hargrove, he said, not to her, to the attorney. I was told this was a routine land dispute. Hargrove said nothing. Aldrich, Evelyn said, and her voice was careful and even. If the Territorial Development Authority's name appears on documentation associated with a federal fraud investigation, the authority itself will be subject to federal scrutiny. I imagine that's not something the authority intended when it agreed to be listed as a co-authorizing body for Pemberton's development plans. Aldrich turned to Vane. "We need to talk." His voice had gone flat and cold. "Now, not here." Vane held Evelyn's gaze for one more second. His face was still composed, but his eyes were doing something different, a rapid reassessment, the kind that happened when a plan that was supposed to be simple had become definitively not simple. "Mr. Reed," he said, "we'll be in touch through legal channels." "I'm sure you will," Thomas said. They left, all three of them, back to the wagon, and the dynamic, as they climbed in, was visibly different from when they'd arrived. Aldrich saying something sharp to Vane, Hargrove staring straight ahead, Vane listening with the careful face of a man managing damage he hadn't anticipated. Thomas waited until the wagon was through the gate. Then Aldrich didn't know. "No," Evelyn said. "He was told it was routine." Vane kept him uninformed so that the TDA's involvement looked clean, a legitimate government body, providing authorization for a legitimate development project. She looked at the road. When Pemberton needed the TDA's authority, they needed it to look credible. That only works if the TDA doesn't know what they're actually authorizing. Can we use that? Oates can. If Aldrich is worried enough about the authority's exposure, he may cooperate with the federal investigation to demonstrate the TDA was misled rather than complicit. She paused. "I'm going to write Oates about what just happened." "Every detail, you saw it fast," Thomas said. "The fault line between them." "The third man stood apart," she said. "Men who are confident in the company they're keeping don't stand apart." He looked at her. "You're very good at reading people." "I've had to be." She said it without self-pity, just plainly. When you don't have money or connections or legal standing, you learn to read what's in front of you because that's all you have. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You have more than that now." She looked at him. "Do I?" "You have everything you built here," he said. "The case, the documentation, the relationships you've built with Oates and Holloway. None of that disappears when this is over." He held her gaze steadily. "You're not the woman who arrived with a broken bag strap anymore, Evelyn. You haven't been for a long time." She felt the weight of it, not heavy, exactly. More like the weight of something real, something that had been built and could be counted on. "I still have the bag," she said. "I know," he said. Martha fixed the strap again. She hadn't noticed. She looked at him, and the simple domesticity of it, Martha fixing the bag, Thomas noticing, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. "Thomas," she said. "You don't have to say anything," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I know you're not." She looked at the road where Vane's wagon had disappeared. "That's not why I said your name." He waited. "I'm not going to Whitfield," she said. "I don't think I have been for a while. I just needed to say it out loud." He nodded. Once. Just nodded. He didn't make it into something larger than it was. He simply received it and let it stand, which was exactly right. They walked back toward the house together. Oates's response to her letter came 4 days later, and the longest wire she'd ever received, so long that the wire office attendant had written it across 3 sheets of paper. "Mrs. Parker's analysis of the TDA connection is correct and has opened a significant avenue. Aldrich contacted our office this morning through independent counsel. He is prepared to provide a sworn statement that Pemberton misrepresented the nature of the project to secure TDA authorization. This constitutes the cooperation we needed. Federal marshals are moving on Dawes in Pueblo. He did not leave the territory. Vane is under surveillance. The internal informant at the land office has been identified, a junior clerk named Horace Sims, who was paid $500 by Pemberton agents to remove and destroy the original documentation. Sims has been arrested. Original documents were partially recovered from his rooms, enough to reconstruct. Combined with the copies you sent, the case is complete. Hearing in Denver is scheduled for 3 weeks from today. Mr. Reed's presence will be required. Mrs. Parker's presence would be of significant assistance. The judge has been briefed on her role in building the case. Thomas read it standing beside her, his shoulder close to hers. He read it twice. "They got Dawes," he said. "They got Dawes." She looked at the last lines. "The judge knows my name. The judge knows your name," he said. "Because you built the case." She stood with that for a moment. In Colorado City, 2 years of work and 3 families with their land back, and her name in none of the newspaper accounts. Here, 3 weeks, and a federal judge had been briefed on her contribution. Something had changed. Not just in the case, in the world slightly. In the way the world was beginning to understand what a woman with a notebook and a lamp and a refusal to accept fraudulent survey dates as clerical errors could actually accomplish. "We're going to Denver," she said. "We're going to Denver," he agreed. The night before they left for Denver, Evelyn sat in the east room with the lamp low, and the notebook open to the first page, the page she'd filled on the first morning, before she'd fully understood what she was dealing with. She read through every entry, every observation, every question, every tentative connection she'd drawn between pieces of evidence that had slowly resolved into a complete picture. She thought about the woman who had arrived at this ranch, soaked to the skin and covered in mud, who had sat at a table, eating venison stew with the shame of someone who'd forgotten how to accept basic human decency, who had been so accustomed to being discarded that an offer of a fair wage had felt implausible. She thought about what Thomas had said, "You're not that woman anymore." She wasn't sure that was entirely true. She thought she was still that woman, in all the ways that mattered: the same stubbornness, the same habit of reading everything, the same 30-second rule for falling apart and then putting herself back together. But she was also something more now, built on top of the foundation that woman had laid. Something that had been constructed in 3 weeks of lamplight and careful documentation and the steadying presence of a man who listened before he spoke. There was a knock at the doorframe. Thomas stood in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. He held one out. She took it. "Can't sleep," he said. "Neither can I." He leaned against the doorframe. "You're reading the notebook. From the beginning." She looked at the first page. "I wrote this the morning after I arrived. I didn't know what I was dealing with yet. I just knew something was wrong, and I wanted to record it clearly. You were building the case before you knew there was a case. It's a habit." She looked up at him. "When things are wrong, I write them down. It's the only thing I know how to do that feels like doing something." He was quiet for a moment. It turned out to be exactly the right thing. This time, she paused. "In Colorado City, 2 years of writing things down put Arthur Lund in prison and gave 3 families their land back. And I went home to a room in a boarding house and made tea and thought, well, that's done. What's next?" She looked at her coffee. There was never anyone to come home to. Thomas crossed the room and sat down across from her. Not dramatically, just sat down, the way he always did, with that unhurried completeness. "There is now," he said, "if you want it." She looked at him across the table. In the lamplight, in the quiet of the east room that had become, without her planning it, the place she thought of as hers. She thought about Whitfield and Clara Briggs and the clean, uncomplicated life she'd been given to build from nothing in a town where nobody knew her name. She thought about what it meant to be known. "I want it," she said. He nodded. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't make it into a speech. He just nodded, and there was something in the simplicity of it that was worth more than any elaborate gesture could have been. "Get some sleep," he said. "Denver is 2 days' ride." "I know," she closed the notebook. "Thomas?" "Yeah." "Thank you." She said it directly, without deflection. Not for the job, not for the room, for sitting across this table at 2 in the morning, and not making me feel like I was too much trouble. He looked at her for a long moment. "You were never trouble," he said. "You were the best thing that happened to this ranch in years." He paused. "Possibly ever." She smiled. It was a real one, the kind that reached her eyes, the kind that had been scarce for long enough, that it felt like something recovered from a great distance. "Good night, Thomas." "Good night, Evelyn." He took his coffee and went upstairs. She sat for a while longer in the east room, in the good morning light that was still hours away, And she thought that she had come here with a broken bag strap and a tattered dress and 31 years of being told, in 100 different ways, that she was not worth very much. And she had built something from that, not despite it out of it. The same stubbornness that had kept her walking through a Colorado storm. The same habit of reading everything that had found a Sunday date on a fraudulent survey. The same refusal to be invisible that had made her stand in the middle of a muddy road and wait for whatever was coming. She had built a case that was going to a federal hearing in Denver. She had built something else too, quieter and less documented, but no less real. She picked up the notebook and turned to a fresh page. She wrote one line, because she had learned that writing things down made them true in a way that thinking them didn't always manage. I am staying. She capped the pen, closed the notebook, and went to bed. Outside, the Colorado night was full of stars, and the south pasture sat quiet under all of them, safe for now, worth fighting for, belonging to the man who had built it and the woman who had saved it, and the life they were going to make together in the house, with the good morning light in the east room. The ride to Denver took 2 days, and they didn't talk about what had been said in the east room. They didn't need to. Some things once spoken didn't require repetition. They rode with Gus as a third rider Thomas had insisted, and Gus had packed without being asked twice, and the miles passed in the companionable rhythm of people who had learned each other's silences. Evelyn kept the notebook in her coat pocket. She had transferred the most critical summary points into a condensed document she could hand to Oates on arrival, and she reviewed it in her head as they rode, running through the sequence of evidence the way she'd run through it 100 times before, looking for gaps. There were no gaps, she had made sure of that. Denver was larger than Dunmore, in the way that a river is larger than a creek, not just in size but in noise and pressure, and the particular energy of a place where many people were all moving toward different things, simultaneously. Thomas navigated it with the contained patience of a man who didn't particularly like cities, but understood them as necessary. Evelyn watched everything. She always watched everything. Oates met them at the hotel on the first evening, and he was not what she had imagined from his wires. She had pictured someone older, more formal. The man who came through the door was 50, lean, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of handshake that didn't perform confidence, but simply had it. He shook Thomas's hand. Then he turned to Evelyn and shook hers with the same directness. "Mrs. Parker," he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him. "For what?" "For every wire I sent that addressed information you'd found as though I was discovering it myself." He said it plainly, without ceremony. The Sunday date, the boundary discrepancies, the TDA fault line. Those were yours. I should have said so explicitly at the time. She looked at him for a moment. "You said so when it mattered." "I said so to the judge," he said. "That's a start." He sat down and opened his case. "Let me tell you where we stand." Where they stood was this. Silas Vane had been taken into federal custody 2 days prior, on charges of conspiracy to commit land fraud, witness intimidation, and accessory to the destruction of federal documents. Chester Dawes had been arrested in Pueblo with documentation in his possession, linking him to 3 separate fraudulent land operations across Colorado and New Mexico territories. Horace Sims, the land office clerk, had entered a guilty plea in exchange for reduced charges and had named Vane, Dawes, and 2 senior figures within the Pemberton Company's parent organization as the architects of the scheme. And the parent organization, the name behind Pemberton, was a land speculation consortium called the Western Territorial Trust, based out of St. Louis, with operations in 6 territories and 17 documented fraudulent filings over 4 years. Thomas sat very still through all of this. 17, he said when Oates paused. "That we've confirmed," Oates said. "There may be more." Most of the targeted landowners didn't have the resources or the documentation to fight back. Some sold, some are still in litigation, some gave up. He looked at Evelyn. "Your documentation is the most complete case file we have against the trust. The federal prosecutor is treating the Reed Ranch case as the primary prosecution. The other cases will follow from it. The weight of that settled in the room." "Other families," Evelyn said. "Like The ones in Colorado City. Yes. Oates looked at her steadily. You've done this before. You know what it means, she knew. It meant that what had started as a woman reading survey documents at a kitchen table in the middle of the Colorado night had become the foundation of a prosecution that would reach back through 4 years of systematic fraud and give 17 families maybe more a legal basis to recover what had been taken from them. She thought about the 3 families in Colorado City, the ones whose names never appeared in the newspaper accounts alongside hers. She thought that she would like to write to them. The hearing is tomorrow, Oates said. Mr. Reed, your testimony will be primarily about the physical evidence, the boundary markers, the timeline of the Pemberton approach, the railroad inquiry 8 months ago. Mrs. Parker, he paused. The prosecutor would like you to walk the court through the document analysis, the defects you identified in sequence, and the methodology you used to identify them. I can do that, she said. The defense will attempt to minimize your standing, Oates said carefully. Your credentials, your formal qualifications. They'll suggest that a woman without legal training is not a reliable analyst of legal documentation. They're welcome to try, she said. Oates looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled. Yes, he said, I imagine they are. That night, in the hotel room that was clean and impersonal, and nothing like the East Room, with its good morning light, Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed with the notebook in her lap and thought about credentials. She had none. No law degree, no surveying certification, no professional title. She had a needle case and 8 cents when she arrived in this territory, and she had a habit of reading everything, and she had 31 years of being told that what she had wasn't enough. Tomorrow, she was going to walk into a federal hearing room and explain to a judge and a prosecutor and a defense counsel who would try to make her seem small exactly how she had dismantled a 4-year fraud, a pen and a lamp, and the refusal to accept a Sunday date as a clerical error. She was not frightened. She was something adjacent to frightened, alert, precise, electric with the awareness of what was at stake. But not frightened. She had been frightened standing beside that creek when the 2 men on horseback stopped and calculated her worth. She had been frightened hiding behind rocks in a Colorado storm. She had learned, in the weeks since, to tell the difference between fear and readiness. This was readiness. She opened the notebook to the summary document she'd prepared and read it through one more time. Then she closed it, set it on the bedside table, and slept. The federal hearing room was full. She hadn't expected that. Oates had said it was a preliminary evidentiary hearing, not a trial, and she'd assumed it would be procedural, a judge, some attorneys, a handful of relevant parties. Instead, the gallery was filled with people she didn't recognize, and she understood, as she took her seat beside Oates, that the word had traveled. Other landowners, other attorneys, people who had spent months or years trying to fight operations that looked exactly like what she was about to describe, who had come to see whether anyone had actually found a way to win. She didn't look at the gallery. She looked at Oates, and then at Thomas, who sat 3 feet to her right with the steady, collected calm of a man who had made his peace with whatever came next. He caught her eye. She nodded. He nodded back. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Carlyle, which was the first surprise of the morning. Judge Carlyle had the kind of face that had been authoritative for so long it had stopped being an expression and become simply her natural state. She looked at the room with the impartial precision of someone who had seen every kind of person and every kind of case and had no patience for anything that wasted her time. Evelyn decided immediately that she liked her. Thomas testified first. He was direct in concrete dates, measurements, observations, the railroad inquiry, the sequence of events from the first Pemberton approach to the hold order to the survey crew on the south fence. He was not a performer. He didn't embellish. He simply told the truth in the order it had happened, and the truth was sufficient. The defense attorney, a man named Croft, who had the polished, combative energy of someone who billed by the hour and considered every hour valuable, cross-examined Thomas on the boundary measurements. Whether he was qualified to conduct a survey, whether the measurements could be considered reliable, without professional certification. I've run cattle on that land for 12 years, Thomas said. I know where every creek and fence line and rock formation on my property sits. If a document says there's a rock formation on the eastern boundary, on the north side of the creek, and I find it on the south side, I don't need a certification to know the document is wrong. Croft moved on. Then it was Evelyn's turn. She walked to the witness chair with the notebook and the summary document, and she sat down, and she looked at Judge Carlisle, and she said her name and her occupation clearly. Croft was on his feet before the prosecutor had finished his first question. Your Honor, I'd like to note for the record that the witness has no formal legal training, no surveying certification, and no professional standing in any field relevant to the documentation she is being asked to analyze. Judge Carlisle looked at him over her glasses. Noted, Mr. Croft. Proceed. She looked at the prosecutor. The prosecutor, a young man named Alderton, who had the careful energy of someone determined not to make mistakes, walked Evelyn through the document analysis with the methodical precision of someone following an outline she had given him. She told the story the same way she'd been telling it for weeks. The sequence, the logic, the specific defects, one by one, and how she'd found them and what they meant. She didn't use legal jargon she didn't actually know. She spoke in plain language, and the plain language was more precise than jargon would have been, because precision had always been more important to her than sounding like someone who belonged in the room. Croft cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He questioned her methodology. She explained it. He questioned her interpretation of the territorial regulations regarding Sunday survey dates. She cited the specific provision and its implementing language, from memory. He questioned whether she had any basis for claiming the certification seal was outdated. She described the difference between the 1,877 and 1,879 versions of the seal, the specific characteristics of each, and the publicly available record of the 1,879 redesign. He questioned whether a woman without formal training could reliably assess the authenticity of professional documents. She looked at him for a moment. Mr. Croft, she said, the defects I identified in the Pemberton survey documentation were subsequently confirmed by the Colorado Territory Surveying Board. The licensed surveyor, Edmund Crew, whose credentials were forged, and the Federal Land Office investigation. The question of whether I am formally qualified to identify those defects seems less relevant than the fact that the defects exist, and I found them before anyone else did. The gallery was very quiet. Judge Carlisle made a sound that might have been the beginning of something she decided not to allow herself. Croft sat down. Alderton stood. No further questions, Your Honor. She walked back to her seat. Thomas's hand was on the table between them, and as she sat down she put her hand next to his, not quite touching, close enough that it was a choice. He turned his hand over. She took it. Neither of them looked at each other. They both looked at the front of the room, where Judge Carlisle was reviewing something in the case file, and the gallery shifted and murmured around them. And outside Denver went about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that something significant was resolving itself in a federal hearing room. Judge Carlisle looked up. I've reviewed the submitted documentation and heard the testimony, she said. The evidentiary record in this matter is one of the most complete I have seen in 15 years on this bench. She paused. It is also among the most clearly organized, which I am told is largely the work of Mrs. Parker, and I would like the record to reflect that explicitly. Evelyn felt something move through her chest that was not quite any word she knew. The Pemberton Land and Mineral Company's claim on the parcels bordering the Reed Ranch is dismissed with prejudice, Judge Carlisle said. The fraudulent survey documentation constitutes federal criminal fraud, and I am referring the full evidentiary record to the federal prosecutor for action against the Western Territorial Trust and all associated parties. She looked at the defense table, where Croft had gone very still. This court finds that the Reed Ranch South Pasture parcel has been at all times the lawful and uncontested property of Thomas Reed. Any further attempts to claim or encumber this property will be treated as contempt of this court's order. She closed the file. We're adjourned. The room broke into noise. Thomas sat without moving for a moment. his hand still holding hers, and she felt through the grip of it the full weight of what had just been resolved. Not just the case, not just the land, but the thing underneath the case. The reason a man kept working a ranch alone for 6 years and never let anyone close enough to make the loss unbearable again. He had fought for something and won. He had not done it alone. She squeezed his hand. He looked at her. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was the quietest she'd ever heard it. Oates shook both their hands in the corridor, and then held Evelyn's a moment longer. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said. "I've worked with attorneys who couldn't have built that case as clearly as you did. I intend to tell that to anyone who asks." "Does anyone ask?" she said. "They will," he said. "The 17 other cases are going to need documentation reviewed, appeals filed, evidence organized. I don't have the staff for it." He looked at her directly. "I don't suppose you'd consider a formal arrangement." She looked at Thomas. Thomas was watching her with an expression that was entirely open, no agenda, no claim, just the complete willingness to let her make her own choice and mean it. "What kind of arrangement?" she said to Oates. "Consulting," he said. "I can't call you an attorney. The law won't permit that yet. But I can call you a legal analyst. I can pay you for your work. And I can put your name on the case files." He paused. "Your actual name. Not the late Mr. Parker's wife or a woman assisting." She felt something click into place that had been waiting a long time to click. "How many cases?" she asked. 17 confirmed. "Possibly more as the trust investigation expands." He looked at her steadily. "You'd be working with families who have been fighting this for years and losing. Families who need someone to read what no one else would read." She knew those families. She had been in their position herself, more than once. She knew what it meant to have someone sit down across a table and take your problem seriously enough to build something from it. "Yes," she said. "I'll do it." Oates nodded. "I'll have the formal letter ready within the week." He left them in the corridor, and Denver moved around them, and Thomas looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as his version of something large held quietly. "You're going to be very good at that," he said. "I already am," she said. He almost laughed. It was the closest she'd heard him come to it, a short, genuine sound that transformed his face for a moment into something younger. "Yes," he said. "You already are." They rode back to the ranch the following morning, and the 2 days' ride felt entirely different from the ride out. The weight that had been building since the first Pemberton wire was gone, and in its place was something lighter and more honest. The particular quality of air after a long storm has finally cleared. Gus didn't say much, but somewhere on the second day's ride, without preamble, he said to no one in particular, "Good outcome." "Yes," Thomas said. "Mrs. Parker did good work." "She did," Thomas said. "Be ashamed to lose that," Gus said, with the elaborate casualness of a man who is careful about what he's going to say and is pretending he hasn't. Thomas looked at Evelyn. Evelyn kept her face composed with some effort. "I'm not going anywhere, Gus." Gus nodded, as if this were information he'd already had but was glad to have confirmed. He clicked at his horse and rode slightly ahead. Thomas looked at the road. "He's been worried," he said. "I know," she said. "Martha, too." "Martha told you?" "Martha told me everything she needed to tell me without saying most of it directly," Evelyn said. "She's very good at that. She's been with us since the beginning," he said. "Since Catherine." A pause. "She was the one who kept this place from becoming completely silent after." Evelyn looked at the road ahead. "She loves you," she said. "Both of them do. Gus and Martha. They've been holding their breath since I arrived. Waiting to see if you'd stay. Waiting to see if you'd ask me to." He was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid to ask," he said. Not defensively, just honestly the way he said most things. "I didn't want to put something on you that you hadn't chosen freely. You came here with a plan and a direction, and I didn't. I didn't want to be another man who decided what your life should look like." She looked at him. "You've never decided anything for me." "I know. I was careful about it, I noticed." She looked at the road. "It's one of the reasons I stayed." He didn't say anything for a moment. The horses moved steadily, and the Colorado sky was wide and clean above them. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes, I'd like you to stay, not as an employee. Not as a person solving a problem." He kept his eyes on the road, but his voice was entirely present, entirely intentional. "I'd like you to stay because this ranch is yours as much as it's mine, and that house has had the right kind of light in it since you moved into the East Room, and I don't want to find out what it goes back to when you leave." She listened to him say it, all of it, and she thought about Gerald, who had never once said anything that direct or that honest in 7 years. She thought about the boarding house room, and the tea, and the thought of, well, that's done, what's next? She thought about a muddy road and a man who walked his horse, so she wouldn't have to carry her own weight. "I wrote it in the notebook," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The night before the hearing. I wrote one line." She looked at him. "I am staying." He held her gaze. "That was 3 days ago," he said. "Yes. Before the hearing." Before the hearing, she confirmed. "Before the judge. Before Oates's offer. I'd already decided." He was quiet for a long moment. Around them, Colorado went about its ordinary, enormous business. "Then we have a deal," he said. "We have a deal," she said. They rode in comfortable silence the rest of the way home. The ranch looked exactly as they had left it, which was somehow both obvious and a relief. Pete at the barn, the cattle in the north pasture, smoke from Martha's kitchen, the wither vane creaking on the barn roof. Ordinary and specific and real, the way all important things are. Martha came out to the porch when she heard the horses. She looked at Thomas, and then at Evelyn, and then at the way they were riding side by side. Not the careful distance of employer and employee, but the easy proximity of people who have stopped measuring the space between them and her face, arranged itself into the expression of someone receiving news they expected and had been waiting for anyway. She didn't say anything. She held the door open. They went in. In the weeks that followed, 3 things happened that each mattered in their own way. The first, the Western Territorial Trust operations collapsed under the weight of the federal prosecution. Chester Dawes cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence and provided testimony that connected the trust's leadership directly to the fraudulent filing strategy across all 17 cases. Silas Vane was convicted on 4 counts. The 2 senior trust figures named by Sims were indicted and their assets frozen. Martin Aldrich and the Territorial Development Authority, having provided sworn testimony that they were misled, were cleared of wrongdoing and issued a public statement acknowledging the fraud. Oates sent Evelyn the full list of affected landowners. It was as he'd said, 17 confirmed. She read every name. She began writing letters. The second, Bill Henderson, came to the ranch 3 weeks after the hearing. He had not sold to Pemberton. He had held through October, through the note coming due, through the hard arithmetic of a struggling operation and a sick wife, and 2 growing boys. He had held because Thomas had told him who he was selling to, and Bill Henderson, it turned out, was a man who could tolerate hardship, better than he could tolerate being complicit in something dishonest. He came to say thank you. He stayed for dinner. His wife had recovered enough to send pie. The third thing was quieter than the others, and happened on a Tuesday morning in November when the first real cold of the season had arrived, and frost sat on the fence posts, and the cattle made clouds with their breath. Evelyn was at the table with the Oates correspondents. The second case now, a family named Garrett in New Mexico Territory who had lost grazing land to a trust filing 18 months ago and had no documentation left except their original deed. She was writing Oates a list of what they'd need to reconstruct the case from the deed outward. Thomas came in from the morning work and poured coffee and sat across from her, which was where he sat now. Not standing in the doorway, not leaning against the frame. Across from her, at the same table, which was where 2 people sat when they were in something together. He looked at what she was writing. "New case," he said. "New Mexico. Family named Garrett. Their documentation is almost completely gone, so we're building from the deed." She didn't look up. "It's harder this way, but it can be done. Like building from a foundation," he said. "Exactly like that." He drank his coffee, she wrote. Outside, The ranch went about its morning, in the particular sounds she now knew so well. She could identify each one, without looking. Pete at the water trough, Gus in the barn, the specific creak of the north pasture gate. After a while, Thomas said, "You're going to get them their land back." "I'm going to try. You'll do it," said with the simplicity of a fact. She looked up at him. He was watching her with the complete, unhurried attention that had steadied her from the first night, and she thought about a woman in a tattered brown dress, standing in the middle of a muddy road, waiting for whatever was coming. And she thought that what had been coming was this table, this man, this work, this morning. She thought that sometimes the road drops you exactly where you need to be, even when it does it through a storm. "Thomas," she said. "Yes, I need you to witness something." She opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote 2 lines, slowly and deliberately, and turned it so he could read. He read it. He looked at her. "You're sure?" he said. "I'm sure." He took the pen from her hand, and underneath what she'd written he signed his name, and then he set the pen down and kept her hand. The notebook said, in Evelyn Parker's precise, careful handwriting, "This ranch belongs to both of us. So does everything that comes after." She had spent 31 years being discarded by a world that measured her worth by what she lacked. She had arrived in this territory with a broken bag strap and a tattered dress, and the stubborn, unreasonable conviction that she was not finished. She had been right. The woman the stagecoach left behind on an empty road had built a federal case, saved a ranch, given 17 families a fighting chance, and found, in the space between a fraudulent Sunday date and a lamp burning at 2 in the morning, the one thing she had never known how to ask for: a place where someone knew her name and was glad of it. Thomas Reed had thought, that night on the road, that he was the one doing the rescuing. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life, and he had never been more grateful to be wrong. The greatest treasure on the Reed Ranch was not the south pasture, not the railroad land rights, not the cattle or the grazing or the water from the creek. It was the woman at the kitchen table with the lamp book and the pen and the 30-second rule for falling apart, and the absolute refusal to let any piece of dishonesty go unread. It was the woman who had come with nothing and built everything, and she was staying.